like to demonstrate a landscape painting. I've got an example of it here, a demonstration I did with my students. I mean, there's lots to do here. It's going to be great fun, lots of different techniques. I will be using masking fluid for the white flowers, wet on wet for the background and the grasses, and scraping out with my trusty plastic card, you know, I love to use, with the tree trunk. Let's get started. And here are all the materials I will be using in this demonstration. I've got a list of these in the description below, and please ask any questions. So I'm just starting to draw. There's not much drawing in this picture. As you can see, I've just drawn the side of the trunk of the tree there, the bottom of the trunk, and the horizon line. So here goes. I'm using the masking fluid. So I'm going to put the masking fluid on. I'm using a PBO pen. It has masking fluid in it, and it's an easier way of applying masking fluid. But you can also use your masking fluid using it with a brush, dip it in some liquid soap to protect the brush, and use your ordinary masking fluid. It doesn't matter. I'm just testing this out to see how good it is, because it almost feels like a cleaner, easier way of applying masking fluid. So we'll see how it goes. So as you can see, I've finished putting all my masking fluid on. I've got lots of small little dots in the distance and smaller flowers and much larger ones in the foreground. So that creates a little bit of depth in the painting, quite good when you want to create a 3D space. So I want to keep this as simple as possible. I'm just mixing up 3 colours, starting off with the Winsor & Newton lemon yellow and sort of not too watery, a little bit creamy, because I'm actually going to be wetting the paper. The Quinacridone gold, Winsor & Newton Quinacridone gold. Isn't that a beautiful colour? It's stunning. And I'm using one of the Daniel Smith greens as well. So once you've got the colours mixed up, wet your paper, give it a good soak. I'm using the large squirrel hair brush here, really giving my paper a good soak. You don't want too many puddles on it. You want the sort of soak, you know, the water to soak into the paper. So I'm leaving a big gap for the sun, the light of the sun here, and painting the lemon yellow all around the top half of the painting. And then I'm putting on the Quinacridone gold, slightly thicker than the lemon yellow, damp into damp for the sort of distant trees in the painting, and then putting on the green, again damp into damp. Trying to keep the paint away from the sun area and just sort of painting this in here, damp into damp, varying the colours. Painting the tree now using some of the Quinacridone gold, working wet into wet there, and now applying some of the green Apatite genuine with a pinch of yellow, and then yellow in the foreground, wet into wet, and dropping in a little bit more of the green now, the Prussian blue mixed with the yellow, with a pinch of the Quinacridone gold, and working wet into wet in the foreground, varying the colours, bigger marks in the foreground and smaller marks as I work in the middle distance, wet into wet with the tip of my brush, and just adding a little bit more paint there where the trees are in the distance, working wet into wet with the green Apatite genuine Quinacridone gold, and just sort of adding those colours there to create the look of distant trees. Dropping in wet into wet some Cascade green mixed with yellow here using the tip of my brush. Using bigger marks in the foreground, dropping in that green wet into wet. If your painting is drying out, just spritz it with a fine mist from a Sprtizer bottle to keep it from drying out. And as you can see, I'm just adding different greens here and there, wet into wet. And I'm using a paper towel just to lift out some sun rays. The painting is still wet, so it allows me to do this. And as you can see there, it really creates a lot of light and atmosphere in the painting. I'm painting the tree trunk damp into damp now on top of that Quinacridone gold using Quinacridone rust, using my size 6 brush. Just mixing up a dark brown using Sepia and the Quinacridone gold, and just putting this on damp onto damp to the tree trunks. You've got the undercolours coming through, but these darks on top. I mean, this is just watercolour at its best, really. These glowing colours coming through, they're just simply gorgeous.
So I'm just going to add a little bit more of that dark, thicker paint, so less water, more pigment, with the sepia and quinacridone gold, working damp into damp.
I'm going to paint in a little bit more dark green grasses here, mixing the Daniel Smith greens with the Winsor & Newton sepia, just painting this damp into damp to really pull out the dark shadows of the grasses. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt on, just ordinary table salt. I'm going to sprinkle it on to the damp paint. So what it'll do is create some texture when it's dried. It sort of soaks up the paint, so the salt absorbs the paint, and it's quite a nice technique. So once the painting is dry, brush off your salt. What I've done now is I've actually dampened the paper again because I want to paint a little bit wet on wet. So I'm mixing up a dark, really dark, juicy dark brown with the quinacridone rust and the sepia.
And this is damp into damp, a little bit more of that quinacridone rust there onto the tree trunk. Mixing up some of the Cascade green here, quite creamy paint, painting damp into damp. So I've wet the paper again, I've allowed that water to soak in to the surface, and I've mixed up some yellow into that green there, working damp into damp. So building up the layers, working light to dark, still working on the damp surface here.
So I'm just continuing on making all these delicious greens and just keep adding the paint in there. And you can see where the tree is casting the shadow. I just want to get some really rich paint in there, because the thing with watercolour is once it dries, it does pale back. So I just want to get all these lovely darks in there. As you can see, my background, it's dry, it's paled off a bit as well. So I'm just going to wet it again. Just be really careful when you're wetting a watercolour painting that you don't take off the paint underneath, because as you know, it's not permanent. So you have to be really gentle with it. That's why we use such soft brushes. So I'm just mixing up a bit of the quinacridone, a little bit of the rust, just some, really, when your palette gets to this stage, you've got lots of other secondary colours that you can put in there. So I'm just putting in damp into damp, some richer colours for these distant trees, and also to make the white in the middle there, exaggerate it a little bit more so it really looks like sunlight coming through.
So I'm mixing up some of the quinacridone rust with the Cascade green, so it's quite creamy. So I'm painting this damp into damp for some darker trees here in the distance, getting a little bit more of that green with the sepia, painting down to the horizon, and painting some trees on the right hand side here, damp into damp, being careful not to disturb the paint underneath. That's why we use these soft brushes. So working damp into damp there, varying the greens, varying the tonal value as well. Some lighter, some mid-tones and some darker trees here. Using the tip of my brush to paint smaller trees there, painting down to the horizon, damp into damp, and you get those lovely soft natural looking edges. And to loosen and soften the painting even more, I'm spritzing some of that paint, allowing it to run down to create some lovely atmospheric effects. I'm using the plastic card to swipe the damp paint so you can see the underpainting. It's a really nice way of creating a wood effect that you've got on the tree trunk here, and you can use the side of the card to really manipulate the marks there, creating thinner marks but also wider marks as well, and to create that look and texture of the tree trunk. So the best way to do this is to make sure your watercolor paint is damp and not wet. If you do this and the paint runs back in on itself, just wait a little bit longer and then try again with the card and only swipe once. I'm also lifting off some of the grasses so you can actually see some of the underpainting here, and it creates lighter looking grasses. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I'm just sort of painting some darks on the tree trunk using the sepia, and I'm using my size 6 round brush. I'm trying to keep some of that light texture that I created using the plastic card. So you're just adding some darks and details just here and there, wet on dry. I dried the painting off again and I've removed all of the masking fluid. And as you can see there, I've got small little flowers and bigger flowers in the foreground.
I'm now putting in the centres. I've used the yellow and a little bit of quinacridone rust to create that orangey colour there. I'm painting in some light grasses just on the base of the tree there because it's a bit dark, and I'm just putting in some sunlit grasses here and there, just adding a little bit more detail, using a lot of yellow and a tiny touch of green.
So just mixing up some more of that yellow in with the green and just painting bigger grasses in the foreground, wet on dry. And adding a few more darker grasses there in the foreground, wet on dry. I've used a piece of paper to mask out the sky area, and I'm just spattering some light yellow green in the foreground using my size 4 round brush. I do love to spatter, so I'm using some white now and spattering that in the middle ground there to create sparkle and details as well. So I did put a mount around the painting to see if I needed to do any more, and I decided not to. But now looking at this painting 3 years or 3.5 years on, I've decided to add more white flowers and just to soften them and to add more grasses. I really felt it needed that in the foreground. Some of those flowers needed stems as well. So I'm going to use some white gouache to help me finish off the white flowers and add more. So I am mixing up the white gouache here with my size 4 round brush, and I'm just sort of painting sort of small flowers here and there, but also sort of adding to some of the petals on some of those flowers. I felt they looked a bit awkward. It's one of those paintings actually that I was never really satisfied with the foreground, but I had to step back from it. I didn't think it would take me 3.5 years to actually add more. So as you can see there, I brightened up some of those flowers here and there, and it really is sort of bringing it to life, and I think making it look a little bit more 3D, especially sort of brightening up those flowers with the white gouache over the tree trunk there on the right hand side. They kind of come forward. So I'm just adding to a few more petals just here and there, sort of reshaping them and sort of bringing them to life, but also adding some smaller flowers in the middle distance. This is all wet on dry. This painting has been dried for 3.5 years. So it's just a nice way of just sort of going back to something and revisiting it. I have to say I wasn't quite sure it was a good idea to do this, but I really wanted to add more white flowers and a few more grasses just to give a bit more depth to this picture. So I'm mixing up a yellow green. So I've started off with the white, a pinch of Hansa Yellow Light and a pinch of sap green, a little bit more yellow there, and quinacridone gold, just to really kind of make it look realistic. Mixing the colours with the white makes them more opaque, so they sort of come forward over the darker washes underneath. Otherwise, if you use lighter watercolour paint, it wouldn't show up against the dark washes. So just making a limey green there, adding a little bit of phthalo green. It was a bit too bright, so I've just taken that colour down the bottom there and added more yellow. So I've got a lovely yellow green there, plenty of yellow paint just to really make it sort of stand out, especially in the foreground. So I'm just adding stems to the main sort of bigger flowers because they were literally floating without any stems. So just adding a few lighter stems here and there to give the sort of painting structure as well in the foreground, and adding lighter limey green grasses just to kind of build up that detail in the foreground, and adding a few more stems to the smaller flowers there in the middle ground. And I'm using a liner brush here, and that's a long thin brush which are really effective at creating long thin lines, and that's what I'm using to create these thin grasses and stems. So I'm just varying those greens, those light sort of limey greens, yellow greens, just here and there, painting quite quickly there just to add lots and lots of grasses there, just to really build up that foreground, make it look lush with all those grasses, adding some of that sort of more brighter green there where I use the phthalo green with the yellow. And I'm mixing up some Hansa Yellow Deep for the flower centres. So I'm painting on top of some of the new flowers that I've just painted, but also freshening up some of the older paint there from 3 years ago. And it's just to really brighten things up and to bring them to life. That lovely warm colour comes forward there. And again, just adding a few more petals here and there to make some of the flowers bigger so they come forward again to create depth in my painting. And I'm just adding some smaller white flowers using the tip of my brush, working wet on dry. And I'm using the white gouache straight from the tube. Finishing off with a spatter here. I've watered down the white gouache slightly so it makes it easier for me to spatter using my size 4 brush. I've made sure I've masked out the rest of the painting. I'm really just spattering that middle ground going into the distance to create sparkle and detail. And just spattering in and around the tree there as well, tapping my brush firmly, mopping up any sort of stray spatters, a little bit more in the centre of the flowers there, and a few more lighter grasses to finish off my painting. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed the extra voiceover as well as the changes I made to the painting. And if you would like to support the content that I create here on YouTube and get access to my exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.